So far, we have covered a lot of the internationally recognized human rights and the responsibilities associated with those, but we've also noted along the way that there is a gap between the norms the international community provides and the real lived experience. Statistically, most people have at least some of these rights violated most of the time. This chapter aims to outline the geographical patterns and the empirical record of human rights violations in the world. This chapter reflects research on the attempts to capture the extent to which certain groups of rights are violated in specific countries. This is an important and crucial step towards protecting human rights in the future and doing justice to those whose rights are currently violated. This is an imperfect starting point because it does not capture the extent to which rights in every country are violated by focusing on the places that perform the worst. But the idea is to get an idea of what characteristics countries have in common when it comes to violations of human rights. To do this, they compare across countries with standard measures of human rights performance. They also use country years as a unit of analysis. This means that the human rights situation is evaluated for each country as a whole in a given year. This approach does not capture some of the important differences between regions in one country or between groups, and necessarily leaves out important information about a country's human rights record. However, in terms of providing seemingly confident findings, using conservative measures in this way has one advantage in that the author is not likely to overcount. Statistically, they are more likely to underestimate instead of overestimate the relationship, which is preferred if you are to make an error in statistics. The authors use the state level measure of civil and political rights to measure the right to life, freedom from torture, slavery, or arbitrary arrest, freedom of opinion, right to change the government, etc. They use Freedom House, which has used survey ratings and narrative reports by regional experts for 200 international entities, most of them states. The reports contain scores on each category of rights. This graph provides a visualization of the global breakdown of the number of countries in the world since 1975 and Freedom House beginning on scoring, placing them in each category that Freedom House uses. Beginning in the 1990s, more countries began to join the free category, while the partly free and not free have declined. In asking which countries performed the worst in the 20th century so far, the authors start with physical integrity rights. In order to measure physical integrity rights, they rely on another standardized measure, the Political Terror Scale, which is a combination of reports from the U.S. State Department, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International on state-level terror issues, concerns, events, and groups. Each country is assigned to a level from 1 to 5 and are as follows. Level 1 represents secure rule of law. People are not imprisoned for their views. Torture is rare or exceptional, and political murders are rare. Level 2, limited imprisonment for nonviolent political activity, but few persons are affected. Torture and beatings are exceptional. Political murders are rare. In level 3, extensive political imprisonment or recent history of it. Execution or other political murders and brutality are common. There is unlimited detention for political views with or without trial. In level 4, civil and political rights violations to large numbers of the population are occurring. Murders, disappearances, and torture are common. Terror affects those who interest themselves in politics or ideas. And finally, level 5, terror is expanded to the whole population. Leaders place no limits on means with which they pursue personal or ideological goals. The Political Terror Scale was created as a joint effort between Amnesty International and the State Department to triangulate data from a number of sources in order to make sure Congress was not funding countries that violated human rights. The website listed here contains the database that is searchable by country and year for anyone that's doing research on this topic. But essentially, the breakdown of countries shows that with examples associated with each level. Uruguay is a level 1. And about 17% of countries fall into this level. 31% of countries fall into level 2, which UK is an example of. 30% fall into level 3, which the United States is an example of as well. The worst human rights abusers beginning in the 2000s were Sudan, DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Colombia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Algeria, with PTS scores between 4.4 and 4.9. The table also provides historical data, which gives an interesting perspective as well. In the 1980s, 3 of the worst performers were in Latin America, while the remainder are in the Middle East, 2 of which, Afghanistan and Iraq, have remained at the top of the terror scale for the whole time period covered. In the 1990s, Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia were all on the worst performers list. This graph presents visual data of global patterns and gives an idea of the number of countries at the various political terror score levels. And this illustrates the largest group of countries falls into PTS level 2 or 3, while the smallest group falls into level 5. The authors returned to Freedom House in investigating records related to Article 19, the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Freedom House compiles its score of overall freedom based on a number of freedoms or rights. So the authors located the specific scores on freedom of the press, which are based on 3 dimensions: the legal environment, what types of laws and regulations limit speech; the political environment, or what types of political control over the content exist; and the economic environment, what types of ownership allowed; do states subsidize the media or control it? 72 countries have free press, 50 countries are considered partly free in this category, and 33 are not free. They include Cuba, North Korea, Myanmar or Burma, Turkmenistan, Libya, and Eritrea. The authors also conduct an examination of economic and social rights to include the right to self-determination, right to work, labor rights, adequate standard of living, adequate food, mental and physical health. Their measurements for these rights come from the Human Development Index, initiated and overseen by the United Nations Development Program. They score countries as low, medium, and high development based on life expectancy, educational attainment, poverty, and other standard of living measures. And this map provides a color-coded breakdown of those scores so that you can see high, medium, and low-income countries as of 2018. And asking why are human rights violated in terms of the empirical record, it's important to first note that the primary goal of governments is to protect the lives of their citizens. And leaders do this by controlling the institutions designed to enforce law and order and defend their people from foreign aggression. But this control can be misused and institutions can be turned against their own citizens. A range of actors besides governments have violated the right to personal integrity in the past, like guerrilla groups, rebels, and terrorists. But governments remain particularly powerful actors, and they have more systematic tools at their disposal. The modern state has emerged both as the principal threat to the enjoyment of human rights and the essential institution for their implementation and enforcement. This is a problem that some transformative justice and critical race scholars have with the institutions themselves. These authors ask when governments are likely to choose repression to deal with a situation, arguing that a government employs repression when it feels threatened in its strength and power, and when it has the opportunity and will to use violence against its citizens. They start with the assumption that states are rational actors that calculate their actions in order to increase or at least maintain their political power and strength. General logic is to stay in power. Therefore, when leaders perceive a threat, they will take steps to minimize it, and as such, repression and human rights violations are employed by governments to deal with threats to their political power. It could explain why the communist power used repression and killed up to 7,000 people who engaged in peaceful, pro-democratic demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. Iran responded similarly in 2009 when Iranians protested the election outcomes, and this was an effort to squelch a growing democratic movement in countries that have a large youth population. Repression can be used in less visible or violent ways to strengthen the government and intimidate opponents. Laws against protesting, voter intimidation or repression, policing, and imprisonment have all been used to intimidate opponents of the government, not just in other countries. Martin Luther King was surveilled constantly by the FBI, as were many local organizers of the civil rights movement in the 60s. In addition, a threat does not have to be real to evoke a repressive response from governments. Turkey suspended teaching licenses and travel permits of all higher education professionals after a supposed coup, which has since been chalked up to a self-coup, which was a mere justification for Erdogan to remove his political enemies. Other responses to threats can be to co-opt a movement or an opponent into the government and effectively take control over that person or set of demands. Sometimes negotiation is also an option. But violence comes about under two necessary conditions. States must have the ability to use repressive violence, and it must have the opportunity. More importantly, states must be willing to use violence and terror, and this willingness is influenced by the degree of accountability the actors in question have to face. The relationship between political terror and democratic rights is expressed in this graph. The terror score along the bottom axis represents more authoritarian governments to the left and more democratic governments to the right. The political terror score is the vertical axis, and the scores are highest in the middle for semi-democracies, about where they score on democracy. The political terror scores are lowest at the areas where democracy is the highest. But at the same time, the scores at the other end of the spectrum where full authoritarianism is represented are half as high as the political terror scores for semi-democracies in the middle. Causes of human rights violations begin with the hypothesized factors shaping willingness and opportunity. First, the authors hypothesize that political regimes will have an impact on a government's decision to use repression and violence. How access to power is regulated and how interactions between those in power and those not in power are regulated influences the opportunity and willingness of leaders to use repression. In a democracy, the risk of governments using violence is affected by leaders' perception of threat as well as willingness and opportunity. Democratically elected governments are less willing to violate physical integrity of their citizens because they are accountable to voters and other institutions. So democracy makes violence risky. The behavior implied by democracy is also that of nonviolence and compromise. So democratic norms affect the willingness of leaders to use repression as a policy tool because of the system encouraging peaceful resolution. The popular support enjoyed by democratic governments is also hypothesized by some to make them less likely to be vulnerable to these types of outside threats. Democracies are less likely to see popular opposition and protest as threats, so repression is less likely to be seen as a solution. In semi-democracies, or those that combine authoritarian and democratic features, there is a high risk of repression. Authoritarian regimes allow for very little activity. They project fear that prevents people from openly expressing dissent. The threat posed by an authoritarian regime thus inhibits people from displaying the type of behaviors that might invite repression. But as political restrictions disappear and the power of the government becomes subject to limits and checks and balances, opponents may regard civil disobedience and violence as both feasible and necessary for pressing their claims. Such mixed regimes are likely to be sensitive to any form of dissent, which means they may violate integrity rights as a reaction to perceived threat. Without a full implementation of democratic protections, people still remain vulnerable. In the most authoritarian regimes that do not allow for competition or participation and where the leader is not restrained, they have, on average, better human rights records than countries that have at least some democratic features. Examples of this level of authoritarianism are Qatar and Bhutan, both of which have hereditary forms of leadership. Governments are more likely to use repression as a response to protect themselves when they lack well-developed institutional mechanisms to channel and address grievances. Popular protest threatening governments because it undermines their authority and expertise. It makes them look unpopular and it challenges their legitimacy. In addition, severity of the violence and reach of the protest increases the likelihood of repressive responses by the government. Violent riots are perceived to be more threatening than peaceful anti-government demonstrations, while attacks by guerrilla groups and a violent rebellion pose an even greater threat and are far more likely to be countered with severe government violence and human rights violations. A civil war is a particularly threatening experience for a government. Government troops and rebel groups violently contest the political structure of a country, the distribution of power, and the way in which the country is governed. A civil war signals that the authority of the current government is significantly damaged. Civil war has dramatic effects on a country, creating destabilization of the political, economic, and social systems. A civil war produces the most serious threat outside of a foreign invasion. During civil war, governments attempt to establish some of their power and control by eliminating members of the group challenging their position. Military or police forces loyal to the government or forces especially trained to torture and kill are used to increase the strength of the regime by using violence against people or groups of people deemed to be a threat. Widespread terror is often employed to intimidate ordinary people and weaken support for rebels. Domestic dissent poses threat to governments, particularly when the protests turn to violence. Governments are more likely in this violence to use violence in return. Threat as perceived by government increases during times of popular dissent, as does the government's willingness to use harsh measures to end such protests. They show the mean values of the political terror score for different degrees of dissent to measure this concept in the bar graph on the right. As you see, civil war is associated with the highest scores on the political terror scale. This bar graph represents civil war and armed conflict data from 1976 to 2007. So as dissent becomes more violent, so does the government's violations of physical integrity. Economic development is also an important indicator of human rights violations, as poor countries have the worst human rights records. Economic scarcity puts governments under pressure by hindering their ability to provide goods and services for their citizens. As a result, governments often lose trust and support from the electorate when the economy is doing badly. Hence, poverty weakens governments and increases political instability. Even basic commodities like food, healthcare, housing, or education might be threatened under such a precarious situation. Governments are highly likely to perceive of potential threats, therefore making it likely that they will use violence to maintain or strengthen their position and power. Figure 5.3 presents a bar chart summarizing countries' income levels and score on the political terror scale. As noted, the mean value of the political terror scale is highest for countries in the low-income category, where citizens earn between $0 and $935 a year. In addition, population size and growth is another important demographic factor that can influence a state's perception of threat and its willingness to use violence. In countries with high populations, there are greater strains on resources, housing, jobs, and services, and as a result, people are more likely to express dissatisfaction and demonstrate against a government. With services that do not stretch to reach the whole population, the government risks losing legitimacy and being seen as incompetent, so is therefore more likely to resort to human rights abuses in order to maintain power. The bar chart on population and political terror scale shows that countries that fall into the 30 million or more population range in 2007 had the highest mean values on the political terror scale. Some previous work on the subject of political terror has suggested that a history of British colonization improves the human rights record of a country, but these authors find in comparing the mean values of the political terror scale for former British colonies and non-British colonies, there is a very small difference. They take this as their departure point to investigate how a starting terror scale influences subsequent scores. Empirical research has found that the level of human rights violations in a particular country does not change quickly. Policy inertia makes radical changes in government policies unlikely. Like other organizations in government, the security apparatus that carries out physical integrity violations is likely to perpetuate its own existence. Therefore, one of the greatest predictors of a country's PTS score is the score they were given in the previous year. These authors ran a regression on their independent variables to see how they impact physical integrity rights scores, and they find that at each level, the time period before is a significant variable predicting the score. This is denoted by PTS level 2, T-1, PTS 3, T-1, and so on. In essence, they're trying to capture the score from the time period previous in the T-1 note. In addition, the authors test the democracy scores to see if they are statistically significant with a confidence level of greater than 0.05 or 95%, and this is denoted by asterisks. The democracy score and the democracy squared score are significant and in the expected directions. The democracy squared term is to capture statistically and numerically the curvilinear relationship between democracy and physical integrity rights. This essentially means that at medium levels of democracy, there are sharp increases in the physical integrity violations. This was also discussed in Figure 5.1. Nigeria provides a good case study example of the arguments presented in this chapter due to its multiple regime transitions, economic development issues, and civil strife. Since 1976, Nigeria has moved between level 1 and level 4 on the political terror scale. During the first 6 years of independence, Nigeria was ruled by a federal government until a coup occurred in 1966 when the army's commander-in-chief formed a military government and abolished the federation. The same year, the North's units staged a counter-coup which led to the massacre of thousands of Igbo people in the northern states, and hundreds of thousands of them fled to the southeast, where a strong secessionist movement formed and culminated in the declaration of the Republic of Biafra in 1967. Then followed a bloody civil war to defeat Biafra, which happened in 1970. The military ruled then until 1979, when they had another return to democracy. This was the Second Republic. Between 1979 and 1983, Nigeria was placed on a PTS Level 2, but when the Second Republic faced multiple severe problems, an economic crisis came, including an oil boom, which had frustrated the expectation of unlimited development in Nigeria. The general election in 1983 was riddled with corruption and tension and violence. Another coup occurred on December 31st, 1983, and Major General Muhammad Buhari initiated a period of repressive rule that he called a war against indiscipline that entailed a large increase in human rights violations. After a bloodless coup in 1985 and under General Babangida, there was greater respect for human rights, but the country bounced between level 2 and 3 until 1992 due to protests against structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Toward 2000, you see an increase in the PTS score, which coincides with Nigeria's military rule, which took over when the 1993 elections were nullified by Babangida's regime. Opposition and corruption and economic crisis led to a deterioration of human rights since. In 1999, Nigeria held elections, returning to a semi-democracy when the election of President Obasanjo occurred. Respect for human rights has improved since the end of the military regime, but human rights reports still have pointed to political imprisonment, police brutality, and murders. From 1999 to 2007, Nigeria was placed on a PTS Level 4 except for 2000 and 2003. The period since 1999 is characterized by the mobilization and radicalization of youths, particularly in the Niger Delta. This is a region that holds large oil reserves, the most important export. Since the 1970s, ethnic minorities living there have repeatedly protested against the exploitation of their land and demanded better economic conditions and political influence. These protest activities have become very violent and led to conflict between militant groups under the Fourth Republic. This remains a region of insurrection. The case study found here ends in 2007, so it does not capture more recent events like the emergence of Boko Haram and its terrorization of Nigeria. The current scale is currently a 3.